So my name is Mike Moffat. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at Smart Prosperity Institute. So this should be number 3 in our budget 2020 bet series. So we've had 2 webinars so far. We're going to talk about 2 billion trees today as something that we can expect to see in the next budget. And then our final one will be investing in a skilled workforce. So if we go back to webinar 1, and the whole sort of point of this webinar series is to look at things that the federal government could do to advance green growth, clean growth, whatever you want to call it, going forward. So that intersection of the environment and the economy. So, looking at what are their, what's the sort of universe of options and what are they likely to do? So if we go back to webinar 1, we talked about a few policies, but I also mentioned that the place to look would be in the liberal platform, going back to the last election. So in webinar 1, we said, okay, well, one of the things that we saw in there was lower taxes for clean tech businesses, this idea that zero emissions companies, and there's going to be some issues about how you define that, but companies designated as that would receive a lower corporate tax rate. They basically have half of their corporate tax rates rebated back to them in the form of a tax credit, lowering their federal corporate tax rate from 15% to 7.5%. So we said, okay, that's one thing we could expect. On the second one, we go, okay, well, what are the other tax instruments? Again, in webinar 1, we went through a bunch of different potential innovation tax instruments, but they go, okay, well, what else is there? And we looked at 4 in particular. We looked at an investor tax credit, flow-through shares model for clean tech, accelerated capital cost allowance for clean tech people investing in physical clean tech, and tariff elimination for clean tech inputs as part of a joint piece of research that we did with the Toronto Board of Trade. So that webinar is available online. You can find it on our website if you missed it. And we went through those 4. We said, okay, why would you use each one? In what scenario? What are they meant to accomplish, and so on. So those were the first 2. But there's more the federal government can do. And in fact, again, we're going to go kind of back to webinar 1 and say, well, let's actually look at the liberal platform for ideas. And one of the big signature pieces in the liberal platform is this promise to plant 2 billion trees. So they call it planting 2 billion trees and using the power of nature to fight climate change. So there weren't a lot of particulars in the liberal platform. There were some details. So the first thing that we're going to look at it, like what exactly was the promise? The idea being that what we see in the budget should be a reasonable approximation of what was in the platform. And then secondly, I want to know, like, is this thing actually going to work? Is it feasible? What is it going to cost? Those sorts of things. So first of all, we'll look at the promise, and then secondly, basically say, okay, if the promise, ends up being implemented in the budget, or something approximating the promise ends up being implemented in the budget, what would it actually do? What would be the outcome for Canada and for Canadians? So here was the promise. It was a bigger package. It was a $3 billion package to plant 2 billion trees over the year. And this, they talk about it creating 3,500 seasonal jobs. They would do a cost share model, and the cost share model is important with provinces, municipalities, and so on. So there were a few other items in there. They weren't going to spend the entire $3 billion on trees. There were some sort of other items that went around this, but as far as this package goes, the 2 billion trees was the signature piece. And although it's, again, 3 billion total, that's over 10 years. So you're looking at $300 million a year. They said they were going to finance this with revenues from Trans Mountain. But I think the important thing to note is it's $3 million per year over the next 10 years. Again, I think once we, have a return to normalcy and have a budget again, this something approximating this is going to be in the budget. So here at SPI, we started to think, okay, well, is this even possible? So can you? 2 billion is a big number, and in terms of both dollars spent and number of trees. We know the federal government could probably spend that much money, but is it is this even feasible? So we got our executive in residence, Dave Sawyer, and another researcher to analyze this question. So what they did was they set up a little sort of toy model and examine the academic literature to determine parameter values, to figure out, okay, how much space does 2 billion trees take up, et cetera, et cetera. We'll go through the parameters in a minute. But they basically did a literature scan going, okay, can we actually, based on what we can tell from the academic literature, is this even possible? What would this accomplish, and those sorts of things. So the short answer is an additional 2 billion trees even possible? The short answer is yes. Because Canada currently has 347 million hectares of forest. It currently has over 300 billion trees. It's hard to get an exact amount, but somewhere in the 300 to 400 billion range. That's a lot of trees. So the delta here, we're just talking about taking the existing 300 billion or whatever it is and adding 2 billion to it. So in that context, that seems like a reasonable thing to be able to do. But we also have to recognize that this is going to take up some space, and Canada already has a lot of forest. So when we look at across the world, Canada comes out far and ahead when it comes to trees relative to the population. We're close to about 10 hectares per person. So we already have a ton of trees, but we're looking at adding a little bit more. So what Dave figured out was basically, first of all, he wanted to know, okay, like, do we have the space for this? And the answer is yes. So there's a lot of assumptions you have to make about, like, what type of tree, where would you plant it, and so on. But based on the academic literature, it looks like we could plant 2 billion trees in sort of available space. So space that could be a forest but currently isn't, and that would take up about 1.1 million hectares. And again, Dave's research, again, looking at the academic research, they did a sort of literature scan because they didn't just want a point estimate, but they wanted sort of a range, and they said it's going to be somewhere in the 2/3 to 1 million to 1.7 million hectares. So this represents less than a 1% increase in the number of trees or forested land. So this seems possible, though. Again, we've already got a lot of trees. So it's this has to be sort of new land, and this could be a variety of things. It could be trees in a city. It could be trees in a lot of places. But this is going to take up some space. But relative to the size of forest, this seems manageable. And note that for this plan to work, these have to be above and beyond any trees that would be planted anyway, right? Because we don't want to sort of finance things that would already happen. We actually want 2 billion additional trees over some baseline. So now we know, roughly looking at this, we go, yeah, it seems feasible. We're only talking about 0.5% to 1% increase in forested area. 0.5% increase in the number of trees, 0.5% of an increase in the number of trees. It seems feasible, but what would it accomplish, and at what cost? So again, we need to go into the sort of determining the parameters and getting parameter estimates. So here's what we need the parameters for. So, first thing we need to think of is, like, when are the trees planted? Is it next year? Is it going forward? If we want to know how well this is going to work, I mean, the whole point of planting the tree is to sequester carbon. We actually need some estimate about, okay, how much carbon can we actually sequester with that? Noting, and I'll note at the end, that there are sort of co-benefits to planting trees. And we also need to realize, take into account that not all of the trees will necessarily be permanent. Some will get cut down, some will be eaten by bugs, you name it. And some of the trees are what we call non-additional. We would have had trees there anyway. So we need to take that into account when we're trying to estimate how much greenhouse gas we could sequester with those 2 billion trees, because the 2 billion probably won't actually be 2 billion. Okay, so the first parameter, when the trees are planted. So the idea being that Dave estimates that, or assumes that these would be planted over that 10-year period, kind of spaced out. 10-year program that we estimate, or he estimates, would cost about 2 billion, or we kind of assume that this would cost 2 billion of the total 3 billion, and we'll actually cost this out in a minute. So again, the federal government, I should say the Liberal Party suggested that they were going to spend 3 billion on a package of things that had trees as the signature piece. We think it's safe to assume that 2 of the 3 billion of that package would go towards the trees. The Liberal platform also said that this would be a matching program. So that 2 billion, we assume, would get matched 1-to-1 by contributions from provincial governments, municipalities, civil society organization, what have you. So it would be a 1-to-1 matching. So the total dollar amount is actually going to be 4 billion, not 2 billion. Though again, we're going to sort of ground test that dollar estimate. So again, assuming that's 1.1 hectares, and we know it's somewhere in the 0.7 to 1.7 range. If we sort of divide out that 4 billion cost, we're looking at a cost of $3,600 a hectare, right? This is if we believe that 4 billion cost estimate to be true, then if we get it at a hectare level, they're talking about $3,600. If you look at the sort of literature, what forestry companies pay and that kind of thing, just the planting cost alone tends to be about $1,000 to $2,500 a hectare. So there's a wide range depending on where these trees are getting planted and so on. And there's other costs as well. So this suggests that 3,600 is probably possible, but it is a sort of rough estimate. And it is a rough estimate because, first of all, we don't know the exact number of hectares, where they're planted, and that kind of thing. So there's an error bound there, but there's also an error bound in the cost per hectare, and there's this unknown quantity of what are the other costs, like land acquisition costs and so on. So again, we've got uncertainty around the number of hectares needed, the planting cost per hectare, and the non-planting cost per hectare. But if we take sort of error bounds of all of those, then where Dave Sawyer and Seibert come, they basically do the math on this. They go, well, based on our parameter estimates, we think this is going to cost anywhere between 3.2 to 6 billion. So 4 billion is on the low end of the estimate, but it's a reasonable one. It's at least plausible. It's within their sort of realm of possibility. So it's not an outlandish estimate, and you'll see again we have some pretty wide error bounds. So now the second parameter we need to think about is sequestration rates. How much net carbon is this going to pull out from the atmosphere and sequester? Well, this is highly dependent on a lot of things: soil conditions, climate condition, type of tree, a wide variety of things. So, if you're planting these trees on farmland and the right type of trees, you could hit 30 tons of CO2 equivalent a year per hectare. If you're planting these on kind of like Canadian, or like way up north where they're going to be kind of stunted, in very weak land, you might only get 1 ton of CO2 equivalent per hectare. So there's wide error bound. Dave's model looks at the range of outcomes between 1 to 11. We don't think 30 is necessarily reasonable, because chances are these aren't going to get planned on sort of prime, southwestern Ontario agricultural farmland. But based on the literature, we've got this range of 1 to 11. So it's a pretty wide range with a midpoint of 6. So that's our sort of middle, or Dave's, middle point, that we think this is going to be around 6 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And this is also obviously going to change over time. That it's the rate of sequestration is not for a single tree is not a constant over time. It also depends on the life. It's also a function of the life cycle of that tree. So what Swire Seibert assume or look at is that rate and change of time, and they go, okay, we're going to assume that this tree exists for a 50-year time horizon. And then finally, we need to have a parameter around non-permanence and non-additionality. We don't want to assume that this is going to be 2 billion net new trees. So the issues here, first of all, not all trees will survive. Some will get chopped down, some will get eaten by bugs, forest fire, that kind of thing. And then some of the trees would have happened anyway through regeneration, right? That just tree dies, another tree automatically kind of sprouts out in its place, that kind of thing. So less than 2 billion trees, the actual net increase, even if the 2 billion trees are planted and are sort of a net increase in number of trees planted, the actual delta there is going to be smaller than 2 billion, again, because you would have had some of those exist through regeneration, and you're going to lose, you're just going to lose some trees due to natural or man-made factors. So we put those together, and again, they did a literature scan of this, looked at forestry company, reforestation in the past, and they assume a discount factor between 15 to 30%. Central is about 20%, like the rate used for afforestation and reforestation offset projects. So we have a discount factor here, that these trees don't all make it. So as you see, Swire Seibert have a bunch of parameters to go into this model. All of those parameters have ranges, because they make the wise decision not to just use a bunch of point estimates, but realize there's a bunch of error bounds on this. So they throw all of that into the model to come up with 3 scenarios: a low, an average, and a high scenario. And here's the outcome as far as GHG reductions go. That by 2030, so 2030 is the point at which all of the trees are planted, but some of these are little saplings that have just been planted. Some only exist for 10 years. You have sort of a range there. The range of GHG reduction is somewhere between 1.8 and 4.1 megatons. I'm trying to remember what our Paris commitment is, something like 500 and something. So it's not, it's not nothing. It's certainly not nothing. It gets us much closer to our Paris commitments. Again, we might be looking at, up to about 4 megatons by 2030. Over time, that increases to 2050, and you're looking at anywhere between 4 to 8.7 megatons abated or sequestered. Sequestered, I think is a better term. So overall, that's a significant amount that helps us get to net zero by 2050. If we're pulling out 8 to 9 tons a year of carbon out of the atmosphere, that helps us reach net zero. And the interesting thing here is that the cost per ton is using all of the assumption and using the cost assumption, not the 4 billion cost assumption, but rather the cost estimates that Swire and Seibert come up with themselves. Using those cost estimates and using this sort of range of outcomes, the cost per ton of the sequestration is between $16 and $36. So that's already a lot of that range is already lower than the carbon price of the carbon backstop, which is currently $30 going to $50. And that carbon price is going to be rising over time and probably at some point hitting 3 digits. So this is remarkably as far as bang for the buck goes, this is remarkably inexpensive. again, so I'm going to summarize that the plan appears to be feasible. We've actually got room for 2 billion trees. 2 billion trees sounds like a lot, but given that we already have a few hundred billion, that's not it's a huge estimate. But we have to understand that there's a lot of error bounds here. If we're trying to figure out the cost of the program and how much GHG it would sequester, it's difficult to get a reasonable estimate because there's a bunch of different parameters you have to throw in the model. All of those parameters have error bounds. So when you throw them all together, then you get a situation with a whole lot of uncertainty, a whole lot of known unknowns, I guess we could call it. How much the trees sequester, where are they going to go, what's the cost of planting, land acquisition, and so on. But what we can say is that 4 billion seems like a reasonable estimate for total cost. It's within a range of reasonable outcomes. We don't know exactly how much GHG will be sequestered. So because we don't know the total cost and we don't know how much will be sequestered, or at least we don't exactly know those things. If we're trying to get a per ton cost, again, there's a lot of uncertainty there. But if we look at the range of potential outcomes, the GHG reduction cost per ton appears to be, the math would suggest that it's quite low. So this is a very cost-effective way of reducing carbon footprint. And final thought on this is, first of all, you can't ignore the other co-benefits and I suppose in theory co-cost to planting trees, right? So trees do a lot of other things than just reducing GHG footprint. You've got issues around water retention, preventing soil erosion, a lot of different co-benefits. So we can't ignore those as well. So we're just looking here at GHGs, but we shouldn't overlook that. Now, when it comes to the budget, we're in a very uncertain policy world with COVID-19. Again, I was assuming that we would have a full budget by the end of the month, and we're sort of living in we anticipated. I think the 30th or the 31st, we would have a budget, and all of this would be included. Things have changed, so it's hard to say right now when this policy is going to get implemented. Though oddly enough, once we start to return to a world of normalcy, I think there's an argument that will be made that in fact we may see this program strengthened or accelerated, I think would be a better term. Maybe the time horizon shortens. And the argument here is like, look, there, all around us, we're seeing stores close, small businesses unfortunately go under. There's a lot of really awful economic outcomes going on right now. Needless to say, a lot of awful health outcomes, but there's a lot of awful economic outcomes. So there's a very good chance we are entering a period of double-digit unemployment that could persist for a little while. So I think the argument to spend a bunch of money to hire people to plant trees is going to be a stronger argument for 2021 than it would have been a year ago, where unemployment rates are around 5% and we're reaching full employment. We are likely entering a world where we are far from full employment. So programs like this one that have employment benefits along with environmental benefits, I think are just strengthened in terms of things that the government may do. So that's it for this webinar. I can be reached by email. I'm like a lot of you. I'm at home looking after kids that are not in school. So my schedule is a little strange, like everyone else's. So first of all, I'm around by email in case you have any questions. And secondly, don't be surprised if that email, you get an email response at 3 a.m. or some very unusual time, because again, we're all dealing with a lot of fallout and circumstances from the current situation. So I'll end this there. Thank you so much for attending. For attending. Oh, I did get one question. So if the trees would sequester around 4 megatons, and it costs 4 billion, wouldn't the cost be 1,000 tons? And the answer is no. So thank you for that question. The answer is no, because we have to realize that that's 4 megatons every single year, but the cost isn't 4 billion every single year, right? So the cost is it's a one-time 4 billion, but those trees don't disappear at the end of the year. Those trees exist for 50 years, or at least some of them do. Again, there's losses in there, so that's why it's not $1,000 a ton, because again, that's the cost is a one-time cost of 4 billion, whereas the greenhouse gas that is sequestered happens every year. So we have to keep that in mind. The cost is the stock, but the greenhouse gas reductions are a flow that occur over time. So thank you for that. And finally, is urban forestry expected to make up too small part of the 2 billion trees? So urban forestry is absolutely considered here. So yes, these aren't necessarily going to be planted just just in wilderness areas. They can be planted everywhere. The sort of the point of the sort of forestry exercise is to see, do we even have enough space? So absolutely, a lot of these may get planted in an urban environment, and that will be one of the things worth looking at when the budget comes out. Just details around that, like where are these trees going to be planted, and so on. So so I just wanted to illustrate that Canada has enough space for all of these, but absolutely, these are the types of questions that are going to be sort of considered. Then what information is available from the feds regarding their plans? Not a lot. Not a lot, and that's a bit of the issue here. That we're mostly pulling this from the Liberal platform. That information was supposed to be, or we were anticipating that information would be provided in the budget. So now we're kind of waiting and seeing. So this webinar is a very anticipatory one. We're trying to figure out, okay, what might they do? So we're kind of in this wait and see scenario. We were hoping we would have more information by the end of the month. We really don't, and I don't expect to get that in March. Obviously, there are bigger issues that the federal government is dealing with right now, so we might be waiting a while. Okay, so I hope that answers all the questions. So just to recap, urban forestry absolutely can be part of this. There's not a lot of information, information that currently exists. Hopefully that will come out sooner rather than later. And then finally, the cost per ton, we just need to remember that this, when we talk about 4 million megatons per year, that's per year. And these trees exist, these trees exist an average of 50 years. So, they're constantly pulling out the carbon. So that's why it's not $1,000 a ton, but rather, this area of 16 to 36 a megaton. So I will leave it there. Again, just thank you for all attending. I got a comment here that urban trees are more expensive on a per tree basis, which is absolutely true. We need to see what balance, what balance that the government is going to do, because that's the kind of thing that needs to, they need to consider is, how effective are these trees going to be? The fact that, urban trees have a lot of benefits, but it's a lot more expensive to plant and upkeep and obtain the land than doing in a more sort of rural, isolated environment. So there's a lot of questions here. We're hoping that the federal government can answer these sooner rather than later. But again, they've got their hands full right now. So again, I'll end it there. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email me. And thank you for these questions. They were really quite helpful. So take care and stay safe, everyone.